Okay, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the 2022 launch conference for our afternoon sessions. This is our second afternoon session starting now. I'm really glad to welcome Taylor Wolford here from North Carolina State University. I'm going to be presenting on Full of Emotions, Emotional Labor and Emotion Regulation Strategies in archive settings. We will take questions at the end. You're welcome to put questions in the chat in the meantime. I'm glad to monitor them, but we'll have plenty of time for some questions at the end. And thank you again for being here today. Thank you so much, Taylor.
Okay, can y'all see the slideshow?
Looks great.
I am very unfamiliar with this side of presenting. Where is the present button? There we go. Oop. Okay, thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Taylor Wolford and I am a special collections librarian. I'm very excited to talk to you all today about emotional labor and emotion regulation strategies in archive settings. This was a research project that was the culmination of my master's paper for a library science degree at UNC Sills. So it was upon further reflection, a very interesting experience to be researching and writing a master's paper about emotional labor during a global pandemic last year in the summer of 2021. And I think that certainly has influenced the way that I approached this topic and the way that I interviewed my participants. So for a brief content warning, this presentation will cover topics such as trauma, grief, and emotional labor. If at any point you feel overwhelmed or would like to mute me and turn off your camera, feel free, I will not be offended at all. What is emotional labor? This was something that I was unfamiliar with prior to my graduate degree. And according to an organizational psychologist at Penn State, Alice Grandy, emotional labor is the management of one's emotions in response to display rules for the organization or job and requires enhancing, faking, or suppressing emotions to modify emotional expression. So for those of you who are in public services, if you've ever had a uncooperative or unwilling patron, and you are very frustrated inside, you're experiencing some frustration with the situation, you know that outwardly you have to be very generous and kind and give them, help them with whatever service they're requesting. That is a primary example of emotional labor in the workplace when how you feel is not what you are outwardly expressing. I conducted quite an extensive literature review on this topic just because, like I mentioned, I never really heard of emotional labor prior to my research on this topic, and I wasn't sure if it was something that was widely recognized and discussed amongst my colleagues in the field. So there was an interesting study conducted by Madison and Miller in 2013 that suggests librarians are trained to suppress negative emotions and convey positive emotions as a primary form of emotional labor. And they also argue that this standard is upheld by professional norms. A lot of this is because we are a service-based industry. So we are providing a service, whether you're public services or technical services, collections development, you are providing a service in a lot of ways that requires you to suppress a negative emotion to serve the customer or the user or the patron. This connects really well with a study that was conducted at Kent State University, and they examined how the negative effects of emotional labor work out in the workplace and may include emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and lower job satisfaction. And as some of you, most of you are probably well aware, emotional labor is quite extensively linked to burnout. At least in libraries, burnout seems to be a very common theme in the literature. And burnout is defined as overwhelming exhaustion, depletion of emotional and physical resources, or a sense of ineffectiveness or lack of accomplishment. Another really interesting sort of secondary theme within my research was that some scholars suggests that those of a minority class, ethnicity, or nationality experience the negative effects of emotional labor more acutely. In addition, those who are older, disabled, with less education, or who aren't cis men may experience the negative effects of emotional labor more so than others because of the imbalance in power that occurs in the workplace. Additionally, there's a really interesting concept that was proposed by a Latinx scholar in the field, Elvia Ramirez. She's done a lot of really interesting work on radical empathy in the archives and also has written another article recently on suspended grief. Essentially, she is an archivist who was tasked with recording and documenting human rights abuses in archival collections as her primary work responsibility. And through that experience of direct interaction with such traumatic materials and stories, was reliving some of her own personal trauma in the workplace. And so suspended grief is defined as the grief or trauma experience witnessed or relived in a library or archive setting. I think generally speaking, this can possibly be applied to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we were all sort of living through this very traumatic event in our personal lives and dealing personally with the ways that it affected our lives. And then we were also having to navigate the nuances of providing library services during a global pandemic in the workplace. And so suspended grief is kind of that interplay between your personal trauma and the trauma that you come to terms with in a library setting. For my study, my primary method of data collection was conducting 8 semi-structured interviews. They were pretty extensive interviews, and the sample population was archivists, library staff, and student workers at an academic library. All of my participants actually had several years experience in library services, so they were quite experienced in navigating the different roles of librarianship. And I used a mixed method study practice with quantitative and qualitative analysis of my participant interviews as the basis of my data collection. So from the participant interviews, I coded each situation of emotional labor that the participants discussed in their interviews, and I coded them according to what the participant expressed they were feeling and what situation garnered such emotional labor or such emotional responses in the participant. So these are the top 4 examples of emotional labor that my participants described in the interview process, and I ordered them in order of frequency here. So challenging work task was the number 1 situation of emotional labor that participants described in the study. Because I was primarily surveying archivists and archive workers, it's more specific to processing archival materials. So the primary participants in this situation labeled working with historical materials as upsetting, disturbing, terrible, sad, etc. Another aspect of challenging work task was perhaps like a library worker felt they didn't have adequate tools or knowledge to complete a work task in a certain time frame. And so that's another example, a more generalizable example of a challenging work task. The second highest frequency of emotional labor was for overwhelming workload. And I think this is something I read in literature, but I think obviously needs to be acknowledged elsewhere, in that librarians and library culture is a culture of overworking as a standard. And so a lot of the librarians in this study expressed that they were felt physically or mentally unable to keep up with work demands due to various factors such as fast-paced environment, competing demands, supervisory responsibilities, low staffing, also the pandemic. There's just so much that can contribute to an overwhelming workload. The third and fourth were also quite interesting to me, and they were organizational and administrative situations. So in these cases, the library worker felt negative emotion due to an organizational or administrative, sort of like an upper level management expectation that they felt they could not complete themselves. And so that does sort of tie in again to challenging work tasks and overwhelming workload. And then for my public services people, negative interactions with researchers was the 4th highest example of emotional labor in my code. Very interesting how it's how putting on a display of feeling a certain emotion you do not feel internally creates real distress in library workers. And I think that was the primary cause of a lot of the public services responses in terms of feeling really negative emotions after interacting with certain researchers. For my study, I tried as much as possible with the qualitative and quantitative data to let the participants' feelings and thoughts speak for themselves. I tried to use their language as much as possible when describing what situations of emotional labor they felt they were experiencing. So I thought this infographic was really helpful to help visualize the very wide spectrum of emotions that participants felt in their day-to-day work life. So it's coded in order of frequency and also uniqueness. So difficult, stressed, terrible, uncomfortable, anxious. These are some of the most highly used words that participants in my study use to describe what it is like to work in a library, which is very interesting and upsetting to see as a professional in this field, that people are feeling so stressed out by their circumstances, by expectations, and by kind of the culture that we've established. And those above us have also established. One of the main conclusions I had from my work is that few participants knew or provided insight on how to regulate extremely stressful or just regularly stressful periods of work while managing such a wide range of responsibilities, tasks, and projects. When I was in library school, I was never educated on things like self-care or burnout or emotional labor prior to working on this study. So I do think that in a lot of cases, library workers are left without resources, training, and professional practices that help them process this emotional labor and develop emotion regulation strategies that would help them with their work. Some recommendations I found in literature and borrowing from other disciplines that regularly deal with trauma in their own work really helped me with in terms of coming up with some great recommendations. So Laurent and Hart are actually archivists who presented on emotional labor at the Society of North Carolina Archivists conference in March of 2018. And they said that support for library workers should be embedded in our workflow and practices. I really took this to heart. So an example of this in my own practices is informing candidates during the interview process that they may be working with historical materials that are upsetting, graphic, and violent in nature, or if they're in the public services realm, that they may come into contact with patrons who are uncooperative or unwilling to work with them on what they need. So I especially make this a priority when interviewing student employees, because I think that they should feel safe in their work environment and know that while this is something they may come in contact with, they are not obligated to deal with such situations. I always want that to be very clear from the get-go. I think there should also be more educational resources and training available for students and professions in library work to enrich their emotional intelligence skills. For a lot of my participants in this study, and just a lot of people I've talked with in general about my work, they had no clear definition of what emotional labor is, and also not a clear idea of how emotional labor is intersecting with their own work practices in libraries or archives or community centers, for example. So I think that there's a lot more training and educational resources that could be provided in that light. And my last recommendation was adopting a more trauma-informed approach to library services, which I will get to in the next slide. So, there we go. So the CDC actually came up with 6 guiding principles to trauma-informed approach, and they developed this specifically for emergency service workers. But I think a lot of these guiding principles can be applied to work in libraries. And I like certain aspects of their guiding principles in terms of providing staff and communities with empowerment, voice and choice. Social support, which is number 3 there, peer support, was also a really significant aspect of my study, in that the participants who relied on their colleagues and peer support tended to experience less negative effects of emotional labor as a result. So in general, moving more towards this trauma-informed approach, I think both acknowledges power and empowerment in the workplace, and also recognizes the ways in which we are essentially facing trauma as librarians and as archive workers in our daily work life. And moving forward, I hope that we can implement a lot more of these workflows and practices and approaches that can help us cope with such traumatic experiences in the workplace. Thank you for listening today. If you have any questions, I've left my contact information there. And I also have a very extensive bibliography if anyone's very intensely interested in this topic. I'd be more than happy to share all of the resources that I have and am still collecting for this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Really important topic for all of us to consider, and thank you for sharing all this information today. Some comments coming into the chat. One person definitely interested in seeing the bibliography, so can definitely get her contact information and send Taylor a message. Zachary Tumlin also offered a comment that we do not care about high degree of turnover and burnout because we know there are too few jobs for too few people. There's always a line of people waiting to step into the meat grinder, at least since the Great Recession. If we're worried about filling jobs, we could take better care of employees. Thank you for your comment. Any other questions right now? You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and say them out loud. So question, was this research difficult on you in any way, listening and absorbing secondhand trauma? So interesting question about the effect of doing the research on the effect of what work in libraries.
It's a great question. And I think that was definitely an unintended consequence of working with such emotional and traumatic experiences, is that I myself was exposed to sort of a secondary or vicarious trauma, especially because I in a lot of cases knew the situation that the individual was describing. So I had that personal background as well. It was difficult to process as a researcher, certainly. And I think also realizing that I should rely on these people for support is really important, because the sense that I got from these participant interviews, at least, was that no one really had a sense of community or support. So when they started telling me all these things that made them upset or that were difficult in their jobs, it was like an outpouring of things because they had no other avenue to discuss such things. So that was really illuminating for my research as well, is that on one hand, yes, I am sort of experiencing emotional labor in this process, but why? And how can I help others in making a more defined community of care and support moving forward?
A question for Taylor, but also for everyone here, and for the group. How could a library worker deal with emotional labor, challenging work tasks, overwhelming workload expectations, especially if that's just the way it is? Organize? I don't know. That's one way that I can think of.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. If anyone wants to jump in as well, feel free. I was previously a part of a a interinstitutional support group for technical services when I was working more in the technical services realm of archives and records management. But I do think just having sort of that sort of community of support where you can talk about common issues that you may be having. I know one thing that our department has been struggling with is transitioning post-pandemic, or sort of in this weird period we're at right now with our research services and engagement in terms of what level of research do we now provide. That's created a little bit of stress, I think, for the department, adapting to our new circumstances. So having maybe a little bit more of an interinstitutional connection in that way could be a really great benefit. And from the psychologist perspective, they recommend cognitive change as the primary strategy for regulating your emotions, which is basically convincing yourself that in some way or another that what you're doing is for the greater good, that what you're providing a service, and if someone's upset with you, that is no reflection upon you or what you are doing. It's sort of a reframing of your mind, which is actually really a practical approach in cognitive behavioral therapy, is changing your perspective slightly to lessen the burden of emotional labor.
Thank you so much, Taylor, and thank you for a comment in the chat. If your institution has an EAP, an employee assistance program, you could possibly speak with a counselor. And we'll finish up with this last question from Roshan, please.
Hi, everyone. My name's Roshan. I'm a library support staff employee, meaning like I don't have a master's or anything. And I've seen in like other industries that I've worked in that when a person is overwhelmed, so much of the support is like assuming that the issue is with the person, like get some, peer support, get counseling, like take your time off and things like that. And it very well could be because of the person. But I think like with the question saying like just the way it is, like I think that questioner is saying like if that's the culture of the workplace or the office, if you have an ability to have a performance evaluation with your supervisor, you can address like, do we have any space to hire a second person? Like, my tasks as personnel changes have happened are, too much for one person. And like, actually speaking that can be very scary depending on like how much power or comfort you feel within an institution. For example, me, I'm an entry level, fairly new employee. So that might be like really risky for me. But from the supervisor's perspective, you're less likely to have like so much turnover and burnout, because if people are just getting used to a culture of like, oh, like if I'm overwhelmed, that means I'm not doing what I need to be doing, without recognizing that there's like obstacles that are like built into the position, right? And oftentimes those obstacles are addressed once the person leaves that position and there's a period of hiring for the new person. And there's like, hey, let's look at that job description. And they recognize, you know what, maybe we shouldn't have put that here. Maybe this person can work with this, etc. And that's good that those are addressed, but it feels sad that they're often addressed when it's a little too late for that one given employee. So that person leaves thinking, I couldn't do it, rather than that this is like an untenable work environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your comments today. Thank you, Taylor, for sharing your presentation and expertise and your research with us. Thanks to all of you for joining us for our presentation today. Just a couple minutes or 1 minute to jump into the next session. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and yeah, have a wonderful day.